Well, what about Mark? What is the evidence for Mark writing the Gospel according to Mark? Again, we begin with Papias writing in Hierapolis, modern-day Turkey, in AD 130. He writes, when Mark became Peter's interpreter, so he was writing under the authority of Peter, he wrote down accurately, although not in order, all that he remembered of what was said or done by the Lord. He had not heard the Lord, nor followed him. So the early church fathers, these men, they didn't seem to be squeamish over the fact that Mark or Luke weren't themselves eyewitnesses of Jesus or apostles. They just came forward and said that they learned from Peter or from eyewitnesses themselves, but that these weren't apostles themselves. They were writing under the apostolic authority of other people, in this case, Peter. Papias continues, he says, later, as I have said, Peter made his teaching fit his needs without making any arrangement of the Lord's oracles, so that Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things down as he remembered them. The anti-Marcionite prologue, this was later added about AD 160 or somewhere between 160 and 180, according to F.F. Bruce and William Lane, who is a Markan scholar. Regardless, these go back to the latter half of the 2nd century. And we read, for Mark declared, who is called stump-fingered. So why was Mark called stump-fingered? Because he had rather small fingers in comparison with the stature of the rest of his body. So apparently they would make fun of each other back then, just like we do today. They were roasting Mark for having small hands. And we read this, he was the interpreter of Peter. That's really what we need to know. After the death of Peter, Mark himself wrote down this same gospel in the regions of Italy. Irenaeus, AD 180. After Peter and Paul's death, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, same idea, himself also handed down to us in writing the things preached by Peter. Mark learned what he learned from Peter, who himself was an eyewitness. Clement of Alexandria in AD 210 in Egypt, they besought Mark, who was the follower of Peter, and whose gospel is extant or existing, to leave behind with them in writing a record of the teaching passed on to them orally. And they did not cease until they had prevailed upon the man, and so became responsible for the scripture, which is called the gospel according to Mark. Here we see it again, over and over again. Mark, not an eyewitness, but he received his details and historical data from whom? From Peter, repeatedly, Clement, Irenaeus, Papias. They're all going back to Peter as the apostolic authority. So Mark's apostolicity was under Peter, and he was writing this after the death of Peter, taking notes from Peter, and writing his gospel from Peter. Once again, a wide geographical distribution, all the way from Rome to Turkey to Africa. We're on different continents here, and they're all agreeing that Mark got his information from Peter. Well, what's the internal evidence that Mark wrote the gospel according to Mark? Well, to begin, why on earth invent Mark? If you were to put a name at the beginning of Mark to give it a, quote, much needed authority, according to critic Bart Ehrman, why would you choose the name Mark? Why wouldn't you choose, as the later Gnostic authors did? Remember, later, a century or 2 centuries later, they wrote the Gnostic Gospels. What names did they put at the top of those Gospels? The Gospel according to Philip, the Gospel according to Mary, the Gospel according to Judas, the Gospel according to Peter. They always picked a big bat, a big name in the early church, didn't they? Are we to believe that they gave a much needed authority by picking the name Mark from the hat? Who is Mark? Who is Mark? Mark was a cowardly defector on the first missionary journey when Paul and Barnabas were going around to preach the gospel in the ancient world. He was the one that went home to his mother in Acts chapter 13. Later, he's responsible for breaking up the dynamic duo of Paul and Barnabas, and Paul goes on to meet with Silas. So Mark, why would you pick Mark? The criterion of embarrassment is in play here. Why pick that name? Moreover, this author refers to Peter more than any other gospel. Now, if you remember, the external evidence from Papias, Irenaeus, Clement, they all said that Mark wrote under Peter. And when we read through the gospel according to Mark, we see that Peter is mentioned more times per capita, per percentage, than any other gospel. Mark is the shortest gospel, just clocking in at 16 chapters, but he mentions Peter some 26 times. Matthew is 28 chapters, and he mentions Peter 29 times. So, by percentage, Mark mentions Peter far more, almost as if Peter was the one giving Mark the information. This is an undesigned coincidence that shows that whoever was writing this was in very close contact with Peter. Additionally, the author never refers to Simon Peter. You know, in first century Israel, the name Peter was a dime a dozen. Everyone was called Peter. So it would be somewhat irresponsible, I guess I could say, to not describe which Peter you're referring to as an author. Unless you're writing under that author and everyone knew the author was writing underneath Peter and everyone knew which Peter to whom you were speaking or of whom you were speaking. It was Simon Peter. The other gospel authors always make this very specific. Mark never feels the need to do so. This author also mentions Peter as the first named disciple at the beginning of the gospel and the last named disciple. This is what scholars refer to as an inclusio. It's kind of like bookends that put the book together. Peter's at the beginning and he's at the very end. What does this mean? It means that this is the perspective of Peter, that he is the one who is supervising this gospel. I'm not saying that this is an airtight argument, slam dunk. I'm saying we're building a cumulative case that shows that Peter is the one who's responsible here. Furthermore, Mark refers to Capernaum as home. Whose home? Whose home? Surely it's not Jesus' home. Now that's the person that the biography is about. That's Jesus. But Mark calls Capernaum home. Jesus is from the district of Galilee and the specific region of, or rather the village of Nazareth. Why would he call Capernaum home? This was Peter's home. This is an accidental throwaway comment that shows us that the perspective is from Peter. Moreover, Mark was with Peter. We know that from 1 Peter 5:13, and he was also with Paul. In his prison epistles, Paul refers to Mark frequently. So Mark, John Mark, would have had access to Peter and to Paul. And think about this. Acts chapter 10, written by Luke, has a sermon from Peter, and it follows a certain outline, A, B, C, D, and E, a certain outline. That same outline is identical to the outline in the Gospel according to Mark. Again, if you had this as two separate papers being handed in as a teacher, you would cry plagiarism, right? The same person wrote that paper and wrote that outline. Well, that's what we're seeing here as well. Acts chapter 10, when Peter would tell the story of Jesus, used the same outline that Mark uses in Mark chapter 10.